e4 Sicilian on the board, knight to c6, and we have the Rossolimo with e5 played here by Magnus. Hans pauses a bit, gives Magnus a small look there, knight comes out to c3, pawn to d6 played, and Hans brings his bishop back. Now, you lose a tempo, but you put your bishop on an excellent diagonal. Bishop comes out, and pawn to d3, knight f6, and h3 played here. Magnus quickly castles. You can see the speed at which Magnus is playing is very huge, and knight h2 played. Well, what's the idea? Maybe he wants to go knight g4 and trade off the knight so that the control on the d5 square will grow. And Magnus pauses here a bit because this move looks slightly artificial to him. It's not natural. You know, a natural move would have been castles. He plays bishop e6, knight comes out, and he plays his knight to d4. Now, a very interesting move here was knight takes e4, which was a bit missed by Magnus. He goes knight d4, which is fine. And now pawn to a4 by Neiman. Once again, there is an opportunity for this tactic, but he goes pawn to a6. Magnus not being very, very sharp here. Now Hans can actually take the knight on f6 and claim that he's slightly better because of the d5 square being weak. For example, you can take, bishop takes, put your knight in the center, and then kick the black knight away with pawn to c3. Yes, he takes on f6, bishop takes, and knight jumps in. And as we discussed, c3 is an idea here. He plays pawn to b5, and that is not a good move here by Magnus. Pawn takes pawn, and look at Magnus there shaking his head, and he's like, what the hell am I doing? Because if he takes with the pawn, then rook takes rook, queen takes rook, knight takes, pawn takes, and the king is extremely weak. Look at this. Queen g4 check incoming, c3, and then the e6 pawn will fall. This is very dangerous. So Magnus put under pressure right from the word go. He's shaking his head here. He's made the move very, very loosely there, b5, and now has to take back with the knight. But this means that the a6 pawn is now weak. Bishop d2 played, an interesting move. He wants to put his bishop on a5. Look at the c7 square there. Bishop g5 played, and the bishop comes to a5. Hans looks clearly better here. Queen d7 would not work because of knight b6 forking. So he goes queen b8. And now Neiman castles. Time-wise, he's 30 seconds ahead on the clock. Also has a slightly better position. Magnus has to be very careful. King comes to h8. And how do you continue next? There are some interesting moves. You can push your pawn to c3. There's also a move like b4. Because after takes, you take back here, and the d6 pawn is very, very soft. And you can also want to play the queen to h5, attacking the bishop, getting the queen into the attacking aggressive zone. Neiman takes his time because he has it, and he knows that he's better. Black pieces do look a bit uncoordinated. But taking advantage of this, beating Magnus Carlsen is never easy. Hans Neiman now using more than 30 seconds on this move, plays queen h5, a great move, attacking the bishop and the pawn. The bishop now goes back to d8, offering a trade, because if takes, maybe queen takes, and this is fine. I mean, you can also come back with your bishop if you want to keep it. But you can also keep it here, because after bishop takes bishop, rook takes. The rook is well positioned, so f4 is definitely an idea. But he takes, queen takes, and now plays f4. Nice move. If you take here, then rook takes f4 is a very strong position for the rook. Also, whenever you take the knight, the bishop settles in and will be extremely strong. So this is a very irritating position for Magnus. And think about it, he has 1 minute 20 seconds. The threat, of course, also f5 and f6, which is ultra strong. And Magnus is not having too many options. The best move here could be f6, so that f5 means the pawn is not going to move one step ahead later. Well, he's gone down below minute, plays f6, not as a happy man there, Magnus Carlsen. again shaking his head and saying to himself that I need to give my best here. Well, what do? You take the pawn on e5 as Hans, let's say. If d takes e5, then already there is knight f6 with the e6 bishop hanging. Rook takes, queen takes, and now bishop takes b5. There's a pin down here, so all these tactics need to be calculated. Pawn takes pawn, you may have to take with the f. If you take now with the f pawn, the problem of course is that after takes, there's knight b6 and problems there. So he plays d takes e5, which is the best move here by Magnus. 45 seconds for Hans. What is he planning next? Not much time on the clock, and I think Magnus would be feeling a little bit more confident because of the time situation. Well, I get it that Hans wants to play the best chess. He plays king h2, but this is not the most ideal time usage. He has 26 seconds only. Now he plays pawn to b3. He pushes pawn to a5. And maybe the queen needs to come back here. Queen e2, queen f3, queen h4. Some plans here on the king side. He comes knight to c3. And now the position is around even. Because after take, pawn takes. Here, white should be slightly better. He takes on c4. That's a great move. And b takes c4 is possible, but he takes with the d pawn so that the opponent doesn't get a passer here. Queen comes in, attacking the knight and the pawn. The knight goes to a4. If you take here, he wants to take on c5. Well, Magnus must do that because the c5 pawn is weak, and if it is exchanged for the c2 pawn, that should be to his advantage. Takes, bishop f7, attacking the queen. The queen comes back, offering a trade. I believe that queens have to be traded. He takes, rook takes d1. And once again, white is slightly better because the knight and two pawns are well placed. The a5 pawn could become potentially weak. Rook goes to b8. And now Hans has an excellent move with rook a3. He wanted to play rook a4, but then comes back and finds the right move. Rook a3. Not only defending this pawn, but planning to double down the a file. He goes rook c8. And that's a mistake now. Knight d6. He takes the pawn on a5. The knight doing some amazing acrobatics there. Rook to b5 played. And now rook a8. He chops off. King takes. Pawn pushes forward. Rook a2 played. And now Hans is completely better. Rook comes back. And he plays rook b8. Blunders here. Rook takes c5 is possible. Takes it. But check. Hans is like, I've seen a little bit further perhaps. Because he's the first one who's reaching the g7 pawn. Magnus goes up. And now takes the pawn on g7. With this he also secures his g2 pawn. Rook comes back. And it's a checkmate.